If you're new here, this channel tells stories of love found in the most unlikely places, stories of courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now settle in because this one is going to stay with you long after it's over. He paid $10 for her freedom, but the price he never expected was his own heart. The first thing Caleb Morrow noticed was the silence. Not the silence of an empty street. Cedar Falls had plenty of noise that morning. The clang of the farrier's hammer, the creak of wagon wheels on frozen mud, the low murmur of commerce moving through a cold Tuesday. No, this was a different kind of silence. The kind that falls over a crowd when people are watching something they know is wrong, but cannot bring themselves to stop. Caleb pulled his horse to a halt at the edge of Main Street and studied the gathering from beneath the brim of his hat. 60, maybe 70 people had clustered around the steps of the old Mercantile. The building had been boarded up since the fire 2 winters past, but someone had erected a low wooden platform in front of it. 3 rough planks nailed together raised just high enough that the figure standing on top could be seen above the heads of the crowd. A man in a brown suit stood to one side holding papers and speaking with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. Caleb did not move closer. He sat in the saddle and watched. 5 months. That was how long it had been since he'd come down off the mountain. 5 months since he'd spoken to anyone beyond the occasional grunt exchanged with the supply boy who left provisions at the foot of the trail every 2 weeks. 5 months of wood smoke and solitude, and the slow grinding work of learning to live with what he carried. He had come down today for salt and flour and a length of rope. That was all. He would get his supplies right back before the light failed and be gone from Cedar Falls before anyone had time to remember he existed. He almost turned the horse around. Almost. Then the figure on the platform spoke, and Caleb Morrow, who had trained himself over 5 long years to feel nothing, felt something shift in his chest like a stone moved by water. "Which one of you," the voice said, clear and cold as a January creek, "will look me in the eye and call this justice?" The crowd stirred. A few men laughed the nervous laughter of people caught between cruelty and shame. The man in the brown suit cleared his throat and raised his papers higher, as though the documents themselves might muffle what had just been said. Caleb's eyes moved to the figure on the platform. She stood straight. That was the first thing, despite the rough grain sack pulled over her head, despite her hands bound in front of her with a length of cord that had left marks on her wrists even at this distance. Despite the cold and the crowd and whatever had brought her to this moment, she stood straight, shoulders back, chin lifted inside the sack. The posture of a person who had decided somewhere along the way that they would not give this audience the collapse it was waiting for. The man in the brown suit was Douglas Crane. Caleb knew the name. Most people in the territory did. Crane ran the first territorial bank of Cedar Falls and held notes on roughly a third of the farms between here and the Powder River. He was not a large man, slight in fact, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was its own kind of authority. His suit was pressed despite the cold. His mustache was trimmed to a neat line above a thin mouth that smiled precisely as much as the situation required, and no more. "Gentlemen," Crane said, his voice carrying over the crowd with the smoothness of a man comfortable behind a lectern. "I understand this is an unusual proceeding. Believe me, I share your discomfort. But the law is the law. This woman entered into a legal contract of debt service 7 years ago, witnessed and notarized, and she has failed to honor that obligation. What you see before you is simply the consequence of that failure." "What kind of contract puts a woman on a platform with a sack over her head?" a voice called from somewhere near the back of the crowd. Crane's smile did not waver. "The kind that was signed freely in the presence of witnesses by a man of legal standing. I didn't write the law, friends. I merely uphold it." The woman on the platform made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a scoff. Something in between. It was quiet enough that perhaps only Caleb, sitting apart from the crowd, caught it clearly. Crane consulted his papers. "She's educated, can read and write better than most, knows figures, can cook, keep house, 10 livestock. I'm asking a fair price for what remains of the contract term. Who'll open at 15? Silence. 10 then. More silence. "Gentlemen, I assure you." "Why the sack?" someone called. Crane's composure flickered just for a moment, the way a candle flame bends in a draft. "Previous terms of the original arrangement. Her former employer requested certain conditions be maintained during transfer. I honor my agreements." "Let's see her face," another man said. "I'm not buying a horse with a blanket over its head." Several men laughed. The woman on the platform did not move, but her bound hands tightened. Caleb could see it from where he sat, the slight whitening of her knuckles. Something about that gesture, the deliberate stillness of it, the refusal to react while still being utterly unable to hide the cost of endurance. He had seen that quality before in men who had survived things no person should have to survive, and he recognized it now the way you recognize a river by the sound of it before you can see it. His horse shifted beneath him. Caleb's hand tightened on the reins. He had not come here for this. 5, someone called mockingly. For the pig and the poke. The crowd rippled with mean laughter. 7, another voice offered not seriously. Crane squared his papers with the irritated efficiency of a man watching a business transaction go sideways. She is worth considerably more than $10. The words came from Caleb's mouth before he had decided to say them. The crowd turned, 60, 70 faces swiveling toward the man on horseback at the edge of the street, the man who had been still and silent as a post for the past several minutes and who had now apparently lost his mind. Crane's eyes found him. Something moved in them, not surprise exactly, something more calculated. $10, Crane repeated. From Mr. He paused, waiting. Morrow, Caleb said. Mr. Morrow. Crane wrote the name on his paper. Do I hear 12? Silence. 11. Nothing. $10 to Mr. Caleb Morrow. Crane's smile returned wider now, and there was something in it that Caleb didn't like but couldn't quite name. Sold. Caleb dismounted. He tied his horse to the rail and walked through the crowd, which parted for him the way crowds tend to part for a large man moving with purpose. He was aware of the looks, the whispers already starting in the nudges between neighbors, the quick assessments of a man none of them had seen in the better part of a year. He was aware of all of it and registered none of it. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform. Up close, Crane was shorter than he appeared from a distance, and his eyes were the flat, pale gray of river ice. He held out the papers with a pleasant smile. Congratulations, Mr. Morrow. The remaining term is documented here, 2 years, 4 months. She's your responsibility until the obligation is fulfilled or until you transfer the contract by legal means. I'm afraid the terms are quite clear about the price, Caleb said. Crane blinked. I beg your pardon? You said $10. Caleb reached into his coat and produced his wallet, worn leather, nearly flat. He counted out the bills without looking at the woman beside him. That's what was agreed. I'm paying this presto, not the contract, not the terms. The price to get her off this platform. A silence fell over the crowd. Crane's pleasant expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, recalculated. The contract is legally binding, Mr. Morrow. Without it, I'd have nothing. Caleb tucked the wallet away. That's fine by me. He looked at the woman for the first time directly at the rough burlap sack. Ma'am, I'd like to take you away from here if you're willing. We can sort out the rest later. A long pause. Then from beneath the sack, a voice quiet and precise and carrying the particular cadence of someone who chose their words carefully. How do I know you're better than this? Caleb thought about it. You don't, he said, not yet. Another pause, then the smallest possible nod. He took the papers from Crane because Crane would cause trouble later without them, and Caleb had not survived 20 years in the Pinkerton agency by ignoring potential complications. He tucked them in his coat without reading them. Then he reached out and carefully untied the cord around her wrists. The crowd was still watching. Caleb ignored them. Her wrists were raw. The cord had been on a long enough that the skin beneath had chafed and reddened in a way that spoke of hours, not minutes. Her hands free didn't shake. They folded together quietly at her waist, and she waited. My horse is at the rail, Caleb said. Can you ride? Yes. Good. He guided her down the steps with a hand at her elbow, not gripping, just present in case the boards were uneven. She navigated them without difficulty, which told him her balance was fine despite the sack, which meant she'd been wearing it long enough to learn to compensate. That told him something else about how long she'd been standing on that platform. Behind them, Crane called out, The contract is legal, Mr. Morrow. I'd recommend you read it before making any decisions about its validity. Caleb didn't turn around. At the rail he helped her mount. She put her foot in the stirrup herself without assistance, needing only a steadying hand, and then he swung up behind her. She sat rigid as ironwood but said nothing. They rode out of Cedar Falls to the sound of murmuring, and somewhere near the back of the crowd, a single sharp whistle that might have been admiring or mocking, or both. They rode in silence for the first mile. The town dropped behind them, replaced by the wide Wyoming sky and the smell of pine and cold stone. The trail climbed as it moved west, switchbacking up toward the higher ridges where Caleb had built his cabin. The horse was accustomed to the weight of two. It was a large animal, a bay gelding, named for no one, which was how Caleb preferred it. The woman sat in front of him, her back carefully not touching his chest, maintaining the exact minimum of contact required for balance. He had his arm around her loosely for the reins, and he could feel the deliberate tension in her spine, the vigilance of someone who had learned not to be caught off guard. He understood that. The trail narrowed where the pines closed in on both sides, and the sound of Cedar Falls. The last wag and the last distant voice dropped away entirely. The world became the creak of the saddle and the patient sound of hooves on frozen pine duff, and the occasional call of something high up in the trees. After a while, Caleb became aware that her breathing had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that someone watching from outside would have noticed. But he was close enough to feel it, the first small surrender of a held breath, the slight settling of her shoulders from rigid to merely careful. She was not relaxed. She would not be relaxed for a long time, probably. But the particular quality of readiness had shifted the way a fist shifts when the immediate threat has passed, not fully open, but no longer braced for impact. The wilderness was doing what the wilderness did. It was indifferent to human arrangements. It didn't care about contracts or platforms or the opinions of crowds. Out here, there was only the cold and the pines and the uncompromising honesty of terrain, and that honesty, Caleb had found, was its own kind of relief. "The sack," she said finally. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "Whenever you're ready," he said, "no rush." A pause, then now. He reached up with one hand and loosened the cord at her neck. It had been tied, not knotted, and came undone easily. He lifted the sack away and held it out to one side, and the autumn wind took it before he could decide what to do with it. She breathed, one long, slow breath, the kind that has been held for a very long time. He didn't speak. He let her have it. When she finally tilted her face up slightly, he could see her profile against the trees, a strong jaw, a long nose, a scar running from her left temple to the corner of her cheekbone in a line that spoke of something deliberate and violent. Her hair was dark and cut short and slightly uneven, as though she had done it herself without a mirror, and without caring particularly how it came out. Then she turned her head just slightly, and he got a clearer look at her eyes. One brown, one the pale green of shallow water over river stones. He had seen that before. The condition had a medical name he couldn't recall, but he had never seen it quite like this in a face that was otherwise so entirely unsentimental. The mismatched eyes gave her a quality of watching that other people's eyes rarely achieved, as though she were simultaneously seeing two different versions of whatever she looked at and weighing them against each other. He looked away before she could catch him looking. After a while, she said, "Why did you do that?" "Do what?" "Pay for me. You didn't know me." Caleb looked at the trail ahead. The aspens on either side had gone gold, and the late afternoon light cut through them at low angles, turning everything amber. "No," he said, "I didn't." "Then why?" He thought about the sound of her voice saying, "Which one of you will call this justice?" He thought about her wrists and the knuckles white around the cord. He thought about standing at the edge of a crowd and knowing something was wrong and walking away anyway, and what it cost you later. He had walked away from things in his life, not many, but enough. He knew the exact weight each one still carried. "Because I was there," he said, "and nobody else was doing anything." She was quiet for a long time. The trail climbed, the air thinned and sharpened. "Then I don't want a debt." "You don't have one. You paid $10. "For my own benefit," Caleb said, "so I could sleep. That's my problem, not yours." She seemed to consider this. "My name is Nora," she said. "Nora Vale." "Caleb Morrow. I know who you are." A pause. "Everyone in the territory knows who you were." He said nothing. "Pinkerton man," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "They say you left after your wife died. They say a lot of things. They say you live alone on a mountain and don't come down more than twice a year." "3 times usually," he said. "I needed salt." She made a sound that might in another context have been the beginning of a laugh. "And instead you got me." "Instead I got you," Caleb agreed. The trail crested a ridge, and the valley opened below them, golden gray in the failing light. And somewhere far down the slope, a creek caught the last of the sun and ran like a thread of silver through the pines. A hawk rode the updraft at the ridge's edge, turning slow circles in the cooling air. Nora Vale looked at it for a moment before she turned her eyes back to the trail. "He'll come after me," she said. "Crane, he always does." "I expect so," Caleb said. "He has money, men, friends in the territorial government." A pause. "He has a judge." I know. You knew that and still, yes. She turned her head slightly as though she might look back at him, then stopped herself. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Morrow. Probably both, he said. I've been called worse. She was quiet again. Below them, the valley held the last of the light, and above them, the sky was going the particular deep blue that comes before the stars arrive clear and cold and enormous. Why didn't you leave? She said finally. Beg pardon. Cedar Falls, this morning. You said you needed supplies. You saw what was happening. She paused. Most men would have kept riding. You told me yourself nobody else was doing anything. That includes the men who actually looked troubled by it. Yes. So why didn't you leave? He thought about it honestly the way he tried to think about most things. I've left things before, he said. Scenes I shouldn't have walked away from in my Pinkerton years and after. You tell yourself there's a reason you're not authorized. You don't have jurisdiction. It's not your problem. He watched the trail. You keep tallies after enough years. Things left and things not left. I was already behind. She was quiet for a long while after that. They rode on into this gathering dusk, and the first stars came out over the ridge, and far below a wolf called once from the deep pines and fell silent, and Noravale did not flinch. The cabin sat in a clearing about two-thirds of the way up the eastern face of the ridge, shielded on three sides by lodgepole pine, and accessible by a trail that was invisible unless you already knew where to look. Caleb had spent considerable effort making it that way. It was not a large structure, one room a sleeping loft. He never used a stone fireplace that took up most of the north wall, but it was solid built into the hillside so that the rock itself formed the back wall, and it had survived 3 hard winters without complaint. He lit the kerosene lamp while Nora stood in the doorway. She didn't enter right away. She stood and looked at the room, the single bed, the rough table, the shelves of dried goods and tools, the rifle above the door, the books stacked in a crate near the fireplace. He could see her cataloging it, identifying exits, assessing threat. He recognized the behavior because he had done the same thing in every room for 20 years. You can come in, he said. I'll get the fire going. She entered. Her movements were deliberate, not graceful exactly, but controlled. She had the bearing of a woman who had spent years making herself small, in spaces that didn't want her, and who had somewhere along the way decided she was done making herself small, and who was still learning what the alternative looked like. He built the fire without speaking. She sat at the table, her hands resting flat on the wood, and watched him work. When the fire was going and the room had begun to warm, he poured water from the ceramic jug on the shelf and set a cup near her hands. That's from the spring, he said. Fresh this morning. She looked at the cup for a moment, then picked it up and drank. He watched her throat move and looked away. Are you hungry? I don't want to be trouble. I need to eat anyway, he said, and there's stew. I made too much. He moved to the pot on the hook above the fire and stirred it, and the smell of venison and dried herbs filled the room, a small, ordinary smell that had no business being as comforting as it was. From behind him, she said, What am I here for, Mr. Morrow? What do you expect of me? He stopped stirring. Nothing. That's not an answer. It is. He turned. She was watching him with the same directness she had used on the platform, clear measuring, not unkind, but absolutely unwilling to pretend. You're here because it was the fastest way to get you off that platform. Come morning, you can tell me where you want to go and I'll take you there. We can burn the papers Crane gave me right now if you want. Nora Vale looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the fire popped and the lamp flickered and the wind picked up outside and ran through the pines like water. Why would you do that? She said at last. $10 is not nothing. Not for a man who lives up here alone. Money's replaceable, Caleb said. A lot of things aren't. He turned back to the stew. I couldn't save my wife when she needed saving. I'm not doing that again. The silence that followed had a different quality from the ones before it. Quieter, less wary. After a moment, she said, I have a sister. He waited. Lily, she's 16. Crane has her. The flatness in her voice was the flatness of someone reporting a fact they have spent weeks trying not to feel. When I refused to continue under his terms, he took her, as he calls it, collateral. Says if I cause trouble, she suffers for it. Caleb said nothing. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table and sat down across from her. That's why he sold me instead of just throwing me out, she continued. He wanted me gone far enough that I couldn't interfere, but he needs me scared enough to stay quiet. She looked at the bowl in front of her. He doesn't know you. No, Caleb said. He doesn't. He'll use Lily against you, too. Probably. And you're still not. Eat your stew, Miss Vale. His voice was mild. "You've been standing on a platform most of the day. We can solve the rest tomorrow." She looked at him again with that unnerving directness. Then she picked up the spoon. They ate in silence, and outside the wind moved through the high pines and the fire spoke in the language of fire. And somewhere far down the mountain, a wolf called once and was not answered. Nora did not sleep that first night. Caleb had offered her the bed, had in fact insisted on it in the quiet matter-of-fact way he seemed to do everything, and had laid out his bedroll near the fire without apparent concern. She had accepted because refusing would have required an argument, and she was too tired for argument. But she didn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed and stared at the low ceiling and listened to Caleb Morrow breathe slowly, evenly, the breathing of a man accustomed to sleeping in uncertain places. On the table, her right hand rested near the handle of the small knife she had taken from her boot when she changed into the dry socks he'd left out for her. Not threatening, just present, within reach. She was aware of how this looked and did not care. The cabin was clean, which surprised her. She had not expected that. In her years at Crane's house, she had cleaned and ordered countless spaces, and she had developed a precise sense of what a man's solitary housekeeping looked like. And it was usually not this. But the shelves were organized with the logic of use nearest the fire most frequently needed. The floor had been swept. The ashes in the hearth were banked rather than abandoned. The tools on the wall hung on their hooks. It was the discipline of a man who lived with himself long enough to learn that disorder cost more energy than order, and had made the adjustment without ceremony. The books were what interested her. Stacked in a crate near the fireplace, Dickens' Darwin, a battered almanac, a well-read Bible, what appeared to be a county recorder's manual for Wyoming Territory, a novel by Wilkie Collins. The Collins she recognized, she had read it twice at Crane's house late at night when the accounting was done, and the house was still, and the lamplight was all she had. She had not thought to find it here. She lay on the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about Lily. Lily, who had her mother's laugh and their father's stubbornness, and who had never not once blamed Nora for any of it. Lily, who had been 8 when their mother died, and 12 when their father's trouble with Crane began, and 16 now, and who had spent 4 of her most formative years watching the adults around her fail to protect each other, and had drawn from this, as far as Nora could tell, not bitterness, but a peculiar kind of competence. As though she had decided early that if the adults weren't going to manage things reliably, she would simply learn to manage them herself. She was 16 years old and she was alone in a room above a bank, and it was Nora's fault. Not entirely. She knew that in the daylight, when she could think clearly, their father had borrowed from Crane in good faith. Nora was almost certain of that. Robert Vale had been a careful man, cautious with money, not prone to gambles. The terms he'd agreed to had seemed manageable at the time. It was only later, when the interest mounted and the notes shifted and the records seemed to move in ways that defied her memory of what she'd witnessed, that she began to understand. Her father had been cheated. She was nearly sure of it. But certainty without proof was just another word for helplessness, and she had lived in helplessness long enough to know its exact dimensions. And then her father had died and the debt had fallen to her, and Crane had smiled his careful smile and explained what the law required of her. She had cooked his meals and kept his books and managed his correspondence for 3 years, while he used her education and her competence to build the very systems that held her captive. She had done it because Lily was there, small and watchful, learning everything, and Nora had thought, not yet. Not yet. Wait for the right moment. The right moment had never come. Instead, there had come a day when Crane asked her to alter a record, just a small alteration. Just one figure shifted, which would destroy another family's claim on their farm, and Nora had refused, and that had been the beginning of the end. Within a week, the accusations had started. She was difficult, ungrateful, unreliable. Within a month, impossible. Within 2 months, she was standing on a platform in the cold with a sack over her head, while a crowd of people she had known in various ways for 3 years found reasons to look elsewhere. She looked at the sleeping man across the room. Caleb Morrow. She had known the name before today. Everyone did. The Pinkerton detective who had put away the Harlow brothers single-handedly, who had tracked the McKenna gang for 3 years across 4 territories, who had retired abruptly and completely after his wife Elena died under circumstances that the official report called an accident, and that nobody who knew the details entirely believed. She had not expected him to be this. Quiet, still, possessed of a gravity that was not intimidating so much as grounding, like standing near a very large tree. Men with that kind of history usually wore it loudly. In her experience, the competence performed the threat always available just under the surface. This man did not perform anything. He simply was what he was in the way of objects that don't need to announce themselves because they have weight enough to be felt. She had not expected him to look at the platform and see her, rather than an item for sale. She had not expected to find the Wilkie Collins. From the bedroll by the fire, without opening his eyes, Caleb said quietly, "There's more wood if the fire needs it." She startled almost. She had been quiet. "The chair creaks," he said. "I wasn't sleeping as deep as I looked." "Old habit," she said. Neither of them specified which habit they meant. "The knife's fine," he said. "Keep it." A pause. The fire spoke. Outside, the wind had died and the mountain was very still. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Nor are you." He still hadn't opened his eyes. "Get some sleep, Miss Vale. You don't have to be on guard here." "I'm always on guard." "I know, but you don't have to be." A pause. "Not tonight." She sat with that for a while, the novelty of it, the specific texture of a statement made without ulterior weight. In 3 years, she had learned to hear the subtext under everything anyone said to her. There was no subtext here, just the words plain as the man who said them. She didn't sleep that night, but she did eventually put the knife back in her boot. And in the morning, when she woke to the sound of Caleb already up and building the breakfast fire, she noticed that he had at some point in the night set the Wilkie Collins on the table beside her side of the room. The first week passed in a strange, suspended quiet, like the silence before a storm that hasn't decided yet whether to arrive. Nora woke before dawn each morning. She was not accustomed to sleeping. Late, Crane had kept her to a schedule so precise, it had become its own form of confinement, and the mountain rhythms matched her internal clock in ways the bank house never had. She heated water. She made coffee. She began working her way through the jumbled state of Caleb's food stores, which were extensive but chaotic, the provisions of a man who thought about survival, but not about meals. Caleb rose shortly after her accepted coffee without comment and went about his own work. He was largely silent in the mornings. She found she didn't mind. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had both learned that words cost something and weren't always worth spending. By the end of the second day, she had reorganized the food stores, patched two of his shirts, and identified 3 gaps in the cabin's south wall where the wind came through. She filled the gaps with chinking because she needed to do something with her hands, and because it was the kind of problem that had a solution. Caleb watched her work without saying anything for a long time. Then, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. Another silence. "Thank you," he said. She nodded and kept working. On the 4th morning, he found her at the table with the papers from Crane spread in front of her. She had read them 3 times through. When he sat down across from her with his coffee, she said without looking up, "These aren't the original contract." He waited. "My father signed a debt agreement with Crane 7 years ago. $2,200 at 6% standard terms." She smoothed the paper with her palm. "This says $3,400 at 9% with a penalty clause that compounds monthly. My father would never have agreed to these terms." "Could he read?" Caleb asked. Her jaw tightened. "Yes, he was a school teacher." A pause. "But he trusted Crane. They'd been in business before, smaller transactions, always honest. My father thought he was borrowing from a friend." Caleb drank his coffee and looked at the papers. "I've suspected for 3 years, Nora said. But suspicion isn't evidence. The original document would show the discrepancy, but Crane keeps his records in the bank vault, and She stopped. Started again. "When I was keeping his books, I was careful. I memorized certain figures. But memorized figures won't hold up against notarized documents in a territorial court." "No," Caleb said. "Especially not when Crane owns the judge." "No." She looked up at him. "You're not surprised." "Corrupt judges and crooked bankers aren't new," he said. "Neither are women holding up better than anyone expected them to." Something shifted in her expression, not softness exactly, but a lessening of the hard-held tension around her eyes. "The night before they put me on that platform," she said, "I asked Crane directly, told him I knew the documents had been altered, that there were discrepancies I could identify." A pause. He smiled, said the same thing he always says, that he had the paperwork and I had nothing. She folded the contract along its existing creases. He was right. "Maybe," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I was a detective for 20 years, he said. "Paper always leaves a trail. Always." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I have a friend. Hank Doyle runs a trapping outfit out of Laramie. Before that, he was a records clerk for the Pinkerton office in Denver. He knows how to find things that people think they've hidden. He paused. I've been meaning to write him anyway. About what? Caleb was quiet for a moment, a particular quality of quiet that she was beginning to recognize, the kind that meant he was deciding how much to say. About something else, he said, but I could ask him about Crane at the same time. She studied him. Something else involving Crane. He looked up from the coffee cup. Possibly, I don't know yet. It was not a full answer. She let it stand for now because she had learned to recognize when pressing would get her less rather than more. Instead, she said, he has Lily. I know. Whatever we do, whatever happens, she has to come first. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. She's 16 years old and she's never done anything to deserve any of this, and I left her there she stopped. Her hands pressed flat against the table. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, you didn't leave her, you survived. Those aren't the same thing. Her eyes went to the window. Outside, the pines moved in the morning wind, and a woodpecker was working somewhere in the middle distance, a steady rhythmic knock against bark. We'll get her out, Caleb said. I give you my word. Nora had heard promises before. She knew the various ways promises broke the gradations of disappointment, from the gentle to the catastrophic. She had over the past 3 years stopped trusting them as a category. But something in the way Caleb Morrow said those 4 words, not with the performative certainty of a man trying to impress, but with the quiet solidity of a man stating a fact he had already decided, made her want to believe him. She didn't say so. Instead, she said, you should write that letter. Already thinking it, he said. He stood, refilled his coffee, and went to get paper and ink. On the 5th day, Nora asked him to teach her to shoot. She had handled guns before her father had kept a shotgun, and she knew the basic mechanics, but she had never been trained, and the rifle above Caleb's door was a different category of instrument from the battered old scattergun she'd grown up with. Caleb considered the request for approximately 3 seconds, then went and got the rifle. They went out to the clearing south of the cabin where the pines thinned, and there was a clear sight line to a stand of birch about 60 yards off. He had set tin cans on a fallen log at some point in the past, apparently as a habit, and they were still there, weathered and dented. Show me what you know, he said. She took the rifle. Her grip was competent, better than he expected. She checked the load without being asked. She settled the butt against her shoulder, aligned the sights, and fired. The can jumped off the log. Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then where'd you learn that? My father, she said, reloading with the practiced economy of someone who had done it enough times that the movements were automatic. We lived outside of town for a while. He thought a woman alone should know how to protect herself. A pause. He was right about that, at least. He was right about a lot of things, sounds like, Caleb said. She fired again. Another can. She was compensating slightly for wind without being told to, adjusting her aim. A quarter-inch left, intuiting the correction rather than calculating it. Caleb watched her and said nothing, because there was nothing to teach. After the 5th shot, she lowered the rifle and turned to look at him. You were expecting to correct my grip. I was, he admitted. Disappointed. The opposite. She looked at him steadily. He looked back. They were close, the way you get close when one person is teaching another, and proximity is part of the lesson. And for a moment he was aware of the particular quality of the air between them, the way it was different from the air on either side. Then she stepped back, and the moment passed, and she said again, and raised the rifle. He spent the next hour showing her the rifle's particular characteristics, the way it ran slightly high at distance, the trigger, pull weight, the best position for prone versus standing shots. She absorbed it all with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, not performing and understanding, but actually understanding, which was different and rarer than people credited. By the end of the hour, she was shooting better than half the men Caleb had trained in his Pinkerton years. Walking back to the cabin, she said, "You're going to ask Hank Doyle about something other than the bank records." It was not a question. He walked for a moment before answering. My wife died 5 years ago. She was in the wrong place, and I've always thought it wasn't entirely an accident. She stopped. He stopped beside her. I never pursued it, he said. I came up here instead. I told myself it was grief. Maybe it was partly. He looked at the mountain above them, the way the rock showed through the pine cover near the summit, gray and absolute. She had been looking into something. I didn't know what at the time. I do now. What was she looking into? He turned to look at her. I'm not certain yet, but I think it may involve Crane. Nora went very still. If I'm right, Caleb said, then the reason you were put on that platform and the reason my wife is dead may trace back to the same man. The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere above them, a hawk called high and thin, Write the letter, Nora said. Write it today. I was going to, he said. They walked back to the cabin in a silence that was no longer just the silence of two careful strangers. It was the silence of two people who have discovered they are carrying the same wound from different angles and who are beginning very carefully to understand what that might mean. The letter came back 12 days later. Hank Doyle had not written long letters since his clerk days, and this was no exception. 3 pages dense and precise. The handwriting of a man who thought faster than he could write and compensated by writing smaller. Caleb carried it from the supply drop at the foot of the trail without opening it, because reading it in the open felt wrong, and brought it up to the cabin and set it on the table and stood looking at it for a moment. The fire was burning. Nora was at the window mending a tear in one of Caleb's heavy wool shirts, working with the neat economy that characterized everything she did. Precise stitches, no wasted motion, the same attention she brought to the account books she'd been reviewing, and to her conversations, and to the careful business of being alive in a situation that had not previously treated her well. She watched him set the letter down. She watched him stand there. She didn't ask. He appreciated that more than he could have said. In his Pinkerton years, he had worked with people who could not abide silence, who felt that every pause was an invitation to fill. Elena had been like Nora in this way, possessed of the understanding that some information needs to arrive at its own pace, and that pressing it just makes it lock. He sat down, broke the seal, and read. The first page concerned the bank. What Hank had found through sources he declined to specify, but which Caleb recognized from the method as the network of former clerks and county registrars that Hank had spent 30 years cultivating, was this Douglas Crane had filed amended versions of 3 different debt instruments with the county recorder's office in the past decade. Each amendment had increased the principal. Each had been witnessed by the same notary, a man named Gerald Potts, who had died 2 years ago of a convenient heart attack. Each amendment had been executed after the original borrowers were either dead or otherwise unable to object. Nora's father was the third case. The original contract existed in the county archive in a file that Crane had apparently assumed no one would ever look at. The original figure was $2,200 at 6%, exactly what Nora remembered. Caleb set the first page face down and turned to the second. His hands were steady. He had learned long ago the discipline of reading bad news without letting it reach your face before you had decided what to do with it. It was one of the first things they taught you at Pinkerton, not the interrogation techniques or the surveillance methods, but this how to absorb information without becoming it. He had gotten good at it. He had sometimes wondered in the years since Elena if he had gotten too good at it. The second page concerned a man named Fletcher Webb, former Pinkerton operative stationed out of the Denver office until 5 years ago. Reassigned, then quietly removed from the rolls then, and this was the part that Hank had underlined, which was unlike him, put on private retainer by the First Territorial Bank of Cedar Falls, Wyoming. Douglas Crane's bank. Caleb set the second page down. He sat still for a long time. Fletcher Webb had been his partner for 4 years. They had worked the McKenna gang together 6 months on the road through 4 territories, sleeping in haystacks and relay stations, and the occasional actual bed, which felt like luxury after the first month. They had gotten into 3 gunfights and gotten out of all of them because they worked well together, because they read each other's judgment and trusted it, because in the particular dangerous intimacy of that kind of work, you learned a man's character from the inside out. He had been in the room when Caleb married Elena. He had stood up for him at the ceremony in the small Denver church where Elena had taught Sunday school. He had wept briefly and without apology when it was done. He had been there at the funeral. Caleb looked at the second page. Then he turned to the third. He read it once. Then he set it face down very carefully on the table beside the others. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. The fire spoke. An ember fell. Nora had put down her mending. She was watching him. He didn't speak. There wasn't in that moment language adequate to what the letter contained. There was only the table and the lamp and the quiet ordinary weight of the cabin around him, and somewhere underneath all of that, a grief he thought he had finished with and had apparently only buried. Elena had not died in an accident. She had been looking into the bank records. She had found the same discrepancies Nora had found years later because she had been following a different trail, the trail of a family she had taught briefly when she was still a school teacher before she married him. A family named Donahue with 3 children, a family that had lost their farm to a debt that shouldn't have been that large, that couldn't have been that large, because the father had been a careful man And the figures didn't match what Elena remembered from the county notices. She had gone looking. She had found things. She had gathered evidence. She had intended to take it to a federal marshal's office in Denver. She had told Caleb she was going to visit her sister. He had kissed her goodbye and told her to give his regards. Fletcher Webb had been hired to watch her, to delay her, to ensure the evidence never reached anyone who could use it. He had done this believing Hank's letter said believing because a man has to believe something that Crane only wanted the evidence suppressed, that no one would be harmed, that he was performing a service for a wealthy client that fell within the acceptable borders of complicated morality. The man who had actually done what was done to Elena was named in Hank's letter. A hired gun named Barlow, dead now 2 years past of other causes. But the man who had given the instruction, who had sent the word that Elena Morrow needed to be prevented from reaching the federal marshal's office, and that Fletcher Webb could not be counted on to ensure it, and that someone with fewer compunctions should be sent, was Douglas Crane. Caleb looked at the wall. The floorboards creaked. Nora crossed the room and sat down across from him at the table the way you sit with someone when you can see they are in the middle of something large. She moved without hurry and without announcement and settled into the chair and folded her hands on the table and said nothing at all. She just sat there, present, steady. The way the mountain was steady, not doing anything, just being there, which was sometimes the only thing that helped. After a while in the dark, he said it was Crane. She waited. My wife. He had to stop. Began again. She found the same thing you found, the altered records. She was going to a federal marshal with the evidence. He looked at the table. Crane had her stopped. Nora's breath was very quiet. Fletcher Webb, Caleb said. He's leading Crane's men now. He was my partner for 4 years. He looked up. I ate at his table. He stood at my wedding. The fire moved. The lamp was low on oil and flickered once, twice, steadied. Nora reached across the table. She didn't take his hand. She placed hers beside it, close but not touching, which was somehow more significant than touching would have been. It acknowledged the distance without demanding it close. It said, I am here and I am not leaving, and you do not have to do anything with that. I'm sorry, she said. 2 words. No comfort attached, no reassurance, no performance of consolation. Just acknowledgement. The same precision she brought to everything. He looked at her hand beside his, then he looked at her face. He'll be coming with Crane's men, Caleb said. When they come for you, he'll be there. I know, she said. I don't know what I'll do when I see him. She considered that honestly. Neither do I, she said. But I think you'll do the right thing when it matters. How do you know? She looked at him steadily. Because you already did once. On that platform. A pause. Whatever is in you that did that, that's still there. It doesn't go away. He was quiet for a long time. The cabin held them, the fire in the dark and the letter on the table between them. We need more information, he said finally. About Lily, about what Crane's actually planning. Agnes, Nora said. He looked at her. The housekeeper. She's been with Crane for 20 years. She was kind to Lily when I couldn't be there. Nora's voice was careful. I think she knows things. I think she's afraid. But if we could reach her. Does she have a way out? I don't know. She's old. She has nowhere else to go. A pause, but she loved my father, I think, in the way older women sometimes love men who treat them with a simple decency. He used to help her carry the heavy baskets from the market without being asked. Small things, she remembered them. Nora's eyes were bright but controlled. She would find reasons to be near me when Crane wasn't watching. Little kindnesses, a cup of tea left at the right moment, a warning look when his mood was dangerous. She paused. She's not innocent. She stayed and said nothing for 20 years, but she's not like him. I've always known she's not like him. I'll send Hank another letter, Caleb said. He has contacts in Cedar Falls. He may be able to get a message to her. And Lily? Her voice didn't change on the name, but something in her shoulders did, the small contraction of someone bracing for what they most want and most fear. Lily too, he said, one step at a time. She nodded. She stood, returned to her side of the table, picked up her mending. He watched her do it, the deliberate, efficient movements of a woman reordering herself after a difficult moment, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not love. Not yet. Something quieter and more foundational. The sense of being in a room with someone whose quality of presence made the room safer than it had been without them. He picked up the third page of Hank's letter and read it again. Then he got out paper and ink and began to write. 3 days after the letter, Marshall Holt arrived. He came alone, which meant something. Caleb watched him ride up through the pines from the window, recognizing the particular set of his shoulders. Travis Holt, 3 years older than Caleb, 20 years a lawman, built like a man who had survived a great deal of weather. Nora came to stand beside him at the window. "The marshal," she said. "I know him," Caleb said. "He's all right." "All right, how?" "All right in the way that matters." He moved toward the door. "He's going to tell us something bad. The way he's writing, he doesn't want to." He opened the door before Holt reached the porch. The marshal dismounted and tied his horse and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation he doesn't want to have. "Caleb." "Travis?" Holt glanced past him to Nora. "Miss Vale." She nodded. "Come in," Caleb said. They sat around the table, the three of them, with the letter from Hank still folded in Caleb's coat pocket. Holt accepted coffee and held it without drinking and looked at the table. "Crane filed with Judge Perrin yesterday," he said. "Formal application for recovery of contracted labor. Names you, Nora, and," he paused, "and the minor Lily Vale as collateral property of the First Territorial Bank." Nora's hands went still. "He's calling Lily collateral property," Caleb said. His voice was flat. "Under the terms of the original debt agreement, I know." Holt's jaw was tight. "I'm telling you because it's coming and because I owe you better than showing up with papers and no warning." He looked at Caleb. "You pulled me out of that canyon 3 years ago. I don't forget things like that. What does the order allow?" "Retrieval by legal authority." "That's me, technically." Holt set down his coffee. "I'm also supposed to report your location to the court." "I haven't done that yet. I rode out here first." He looked between them. "I'm about to make a decision that will cost me my badge if it goes wrong. I want to know what I'm working with before I make it." Caleb reached into his coat and took out Hank's letter. He laid it on the table. Holt read it in silence. When he was done, his face had changed, still controlled, still martial, but something underneath it had shifted. "This is sworn information. From a former Pinkerton records clerk. I'll get you an affidavit if you need it." "I'll need more than one." Holt folded the letter carefully. "Perrin is Crane's judge. I'd need to go above him, and that takes time." He looked at Nora. "How long has your sister been in there?" "Since I ran," she said, 11 weeks. "She being harmed. When I was there, she wasn't. But she stopped. I don't know now." Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "There's a solution that buys time. I don't love it, and I don't know how you'll feel about it." Caleb waited. "A married woman can't be held under a labor debt contract. Not in Wyoming territory. Law's clear on that. The husband's standing supersedes prior obligations." He looked at them both. "If you were married, legally filed with the county, Crane's recovery order would have no standing." Nora pushed back from the table. Not dramatically, just a few inches of physical expression of internal distance. "No." Holt nodded as though he expected this. "It's just, I heard you the first time." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were on the window. "I have spent 3 years having my life managed by paperwork. I am not solving that problem with more paperwork." A pause. "A piece of paper is not protection. A piece of paper is a leash with a different end." The room was quiet. Then Caleb said, "She's right." Holt looked at him. "A marriage on paper won't hold if Crane challenges it seriously. He has the judge. He has the resources." Caleb's voice was calm. "They need the evidence, Travis. The actual evidence, the original contract, the discrepancy testimony from someone who witnessed Crane alter those documents." He looked at Nora. "We need Agnes." Nora turned from the window. She looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of someone recalculating. "If Agnes will talk," she said. "If Agnes will talk," Caleb agreed. "Then we take it to the federal marshal's office, directly bypassing Perrin entirely. Hank has a contact there." He looked at Holt. "And you get Lily out beforehand while the motion is still pending and Crane thinks he has time." Holt considered this. "I can get to the girl. It's within my authority to conduct a welfare check on a minor named in a legal proceeding. Crane can't legally prevent access." He picked up his coffee. "But if it goes wrong and Crane moves before we have the evidence, you'll be outside the law and I can't protect you." "I've been outside the law before," Caleb said. Holt looked at him with something that was almost a smile. "Yes, you have." He stood. "I'll reach the federal office in Laramie by wire. I won't tell them where you are. Yet." He put on his hat. "You have a week, maybe 10 days before Crane's patience runs out. He'll send men before the legal process winds up. I've seen him do it before. He papers the town with lawyers and empties the territory with guns. We know, Nora said. Holt nodded at her, not the nod of a man to a woman in distress, but the nod of one capable person to another. Then he went out and they listened to his horse moving away through the pines. When he was gone, Nora stood at the table with her hands flat against the wood. I meant what I said, she told him. About the paper. I know. I don't want to be saved that way. I want to be... She stopped. I want to be free because the truth came out, not because someone filed a form. Caleb looked at her. Then that's what we'll do, he said. We'll get the truth out. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, why are you doing this, Caleb? She had started using his given name 3 days ago, not as a gesture of intimacy, but as a gesture of equal standing, he thought. He had noticed. Because Crane took something from me, he said, and because what he took from you is worse. He met her eyes. And because you're worth fighting for Nora Vale, in case no one has told you that recently. The fire cracked. The wind moved outside. She didn't say anything, but she held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary and then looked away, and there was something in that small turning away that told him more than any words would have. We should write Hank, she said, about Agnes. Yes, he said, we should. The letter to Agnes was more difficult to write than the one to Hank. Nora tried twice and threw both versions into the fire. The first was too careful, so guarded against interception that it said nothing. The second veered into a rawness she didn't trust, threw paper across miles to a woman who had every reason to be afraid and no particular reason to be brave. On the third attempt, she sat still for a long time and thought about Agnes, the way she moved through Crane's house with the habitual invisibility of a woman who had spent decades making herself unobtrusive. The small kindnesses, the extra blanket left outside Lily's door in winter. The cup of tea set beside Nora when the account books ran long. The way Agnes's eyes sometimes held something and then didn't, and Nora had learned not to ask. She picked up the pen and wrote, Agnes, I am safe. Lily is in my thoughts every hour. I know you are afraid, and I know you have your own reasons for what you've done and not done, and I am not asking you to be brave for me. I'm asking you to be brave for yourself. There are people who can protect you now if you choose to let them. There is a man here who was a detective for 20 years and who is very patient and very thorough. He will not put you in harm's way. If you have anything at all that you have been holding on to, now is the time. I have never once believed you were like him. I am asking you to believe it too. She signed it with her name and nothing else. She handed it to Caleb. He read it without comment, folded it, and sealed it. She'll come through, Nora said. It was half certainty, half prayer. I think so too, he said. 4 more days passed. They were the strangest days Nora had experienced since long before any of this strange, not for their danger, which was constant and low and present like weather, but for their texture. The days had the quality of something being built slowly. Caleb was not a man who occupied space loudly. He moved quietly, worked efficiently, and spoke with the precision of someone for whom words were instruments rather than performance. In another context, she might have found this cold. Here on this mountain, she found it restful in a way she hadn't known she needed. They talked in the evenings, not deeply, not always. Sometimes they were silent for hours and it wasn't uncomfortable. But sometimes with the fire burning and the wind working through the high pines and Nora mending or reading from the battered copy of Dickens on his shelf and Caleb tending his traps or writing, one of them would say something and the other would answer, and a conversation would grow up of its own accord, rooting in the silence and growing toward the light. She learned he had grown up in Ohio. His father was a carpenter. He had read every book he could get his hands on as a boy and had joined the Pinkertons at 22 because he wanted to see the country and had instead mostly seen its worst possibilities. He had met Elena at a church social in Denver. She had been the school teacher, he had been in town between assignments, and she had laughed at something he said, and he had never quite recovered from that. He said this last part without self-consciousness as a simple fact, and it undid her a little. She told him she had wanted to be a physician. She had had the aptitude, the teacher said so, but aptitude and the means to pursue it were different things, and by the time her father's situation had become clear, there were no more choices about what she would be. She had been Crane's accountant by necessity for 3 years and had gotten very good at it, and she hated that she had. The skills you developed under duress, Caleb said, don't belong to him. She looked at him. You built those skills, he said, under his roof, under his terms, but you built them. They're yours. The fact that he benefited from them doesn't give him ownership. She sat with that for a while. You sound like a man who's told himself something similar, she said. More than once, he said. On the 11th day after the first letter, Hank sent word. Agnes had responded. She had in fact been waiting for a reason to respond for 2 years, and she had not been keeping merely a memory of the discrepancies. She had been keeping the original document. She has it, Nora said. She had read the message 3 times. She was standing at the table and her hands were completely steady, and there were tears on her face, and she seemed unaware of this. The original contract, Caleb said, the one your father signed. She took it from the files when Crane's secretary died, said she'd been watching him for years waiting to understand what he was. Said she took it because she thought someday it might matter. A pause. She said, Nora's voice caught for just a moment, then steadied. She said she told my father once that she thought Crane was a wicked man in a press suit. My father laughed and said most wicked men were. She said she never forgot that. Caleb looked at the message in her hand. She'll give it to Holt, Caleb said. If we can get word to her through Hank, Holt can use it to go over Perrin's head directly. She'll need protection. Nora wiped her face, apparently noticing the tears at that moment. Crane will know it was her. Hank can get her out. He has a sister in Cheyenne. He was already thinking through the steps. Holt moves on Lily at the same time Agnes gives him the document. That way Crane has no leverage left before he knows the evidence is gone. Nora looked at him. And Fletcher. I'll deal with Fletcher. Caleb. I'll deal with him, he said again. I don't mean what you might think I mean. She studied his face. What do you mean? I mean, I'll talk to him first. His voice was quiet. I don't believe he ordered what happened to Elena. I think he was used like we've been used, like your father was used. He made choices I wouldn't have made, but I think he knows what those choices cost him. He paused. I want to give him the chance to say so. Nora was quiet for a moment, then, that's a generous thing to believe about a man who helped get your wife killed. Maybe. He looked at the window. Elena would have said the same. She believed in what was in people more than what they'd done. He paused. It's something I've been slow to learn. The fire spoke. Outside, the afternoon was going gray with the approach of weather. Not the violent weather yet that was still days away, but the preliminary gray that comes before it, the sky pulling in on itself. Nora crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Not close, not far. Present. When this is over, she said, and Lily is safe and Crane is dealt with, what do you want? He looked at her. Not for me, she said. For yourself. What do you want from whatever comes next? He was quiet for a while. Less of nothing, he said at last. I've been very good at nothing for 5 years. It stopped working somewhere in the last 2 weeks, and I'd like to try something else. He looked at her. What about you? I want to study medicine, she said immediately, as though the answer had been waiting. I know women don't, not usually, not formally, but there are schools now, in the East, and I have enough arithmetic in my head to manage the entrance. I've been telling myself it's too late for 10 years, and I've decided to stop telling myself that. Good, he said. You're not going to tell me it's impractical. No, he said. I'm going to say it sounds exactly like the right thing for exactly the right person. He looked back at the window. Lily can study here while you're gone. I'll make sure she's safe. She turned to look at him fully. You'd do that. I'm doing a lot of things I wouldn't have predicted 2 weeks ago. He glanced at her. Apparently you have that effect. She made a sound, a real laugh this time, brief and surprised and warmer than she probably intended it to be. She covered it quickly with her hand, but the warmth was already in the room. I should write Hank, she said, about Agnes, about the timing. Yes, he said. She didn't move. Caleb, she said. Yes. I don't want to be just something you rescued. When I'm a physician and I look back at this, I want to have been someone you were glad to know. Not someone you felt obligated to. He looked at her steadily. That ship sailed about day 3, he said, when you rechinking my wall without being asked. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved. Then she said very quietly, I'm glad you needed salt. Best supply run I ever made, he said. She turned back to the table and picked up the pen, and the moment arranged itself back into something that could be lived in. And Caleb Morrow looked at the gray window and felt something inside him that had been rigid for 5 years begin very slowly to let go. The 5th day, Nora asked him to teach her to shoot. She had handled guns before her father had kept a shotgun, and she knew the basic mechanics, but she had never been formally trained, and the rifle above Caleb's door was a different instrument from the battered old scatterguns she'd grown up with. Caleb considered the request for approximately 3 seconds, then went and got the rifle. They went out to the clearing south of the cabin where the pines thinned and there was a clear sight line to a stand of birch about 60 yards off. He had set tin cans on a fallen log at some point in the past, apparently as a standing habit, and they were still there, weathered and dented and patient in the way of objects that had been waiting for a purpose. "Show me what you know," he said. She took the rifle. Her grip was competent, better than he expected. She checked the load without being asked. She settled the butt against her shoulder, aligned the sights, and fired. The can jumped off the log. Caleb said nothing for a moment. "Then where'd you learn that?" "My father," she said, reloading with the practiced economy of someone who had done it enough times that the movements were automatic. "We lived outside of town for a while when I was young, before the school job in Rawlins. He thought a woman alone should know how to protect herself." A pause. He was right about that, at least. She fired again. Another can. She was compensating slightly for wind without being told to, adjusting her aim a quarter-inch left, intuiting the correction rather than calculating it. He watched her do it and found himself genuinely surprised, which didn't happen often. He spent the next hour showing her the rifle's particular characteristics, the way it ran slightly high at distance, the trigger pull weight, the best position for prone versus standing shots. She absorbed it all with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything, not performing understanding, but actually understanding, which was different and rarer than people credited. By the end of the hour, she was shooting better than half the men Caleb had trained in his Pinkerton years. Walking back to the cabin, she said, "You're going to ask Hank Doyle about something other than the bank records." It was not a question. He walked for a moment before answering. "My wife died 5 years ago. She was in the wrong place, and I've always thought it wasn't entirely an accident." She stopped. He stopped beside her. "I never pursued it," he said. "I came up here instead. I told myself it was grief. Maybe it was partly." He looked at the mountain above them, the way the rocks showed through the pine cover near the summit, gray and absolute. She had been looking into something. I didn't know what at the time. I know more now. The name Crane keeps appearing at the edges of what I remember. Nora went very still. She looked at him. He looked at her. The cold air moved between them, carrying the smell of pine and the distant promise of snow. "If I'm right," Caleb said, "then the reason you were put on that platform and the reason my wife is dead may trace back to the same man." The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere above them, Hawk called high and thin and then went silent. "Write the letter," Nora said. "Write it today." "I was going to," he said. They walked back to the cabin, and the silence between them had changed again. Not the silence of two careful strangers now, nor even the silence of two people who had agreed to share a space, but something with more weight to it and more warmth. The silence of two people who have discovered they are carrying the same wound from different directions and who are beginning very carefully to understand what that might mean. On the 7th evening, with snow coming down outside and the fire built high, Nora set down her mending and said, "Tell me about Elena." He looked up from the trap he was mending. "You don't have to," she said. "But I think you've been carrying her as a weight for 5 years, as a failure." A pause. "She found the same evidence I found. She tried to do something about it. She was braver than most people with twice her resources." Nora met his eyes steadily. "She deserves to be spoken about that way." He set down the trap. "She was a school teacher," he said, "before we married, before she came with me from posting to posting. She kept teaching whenever we stayed somewhere long enough, small classes, reading groups, whatever was needed. She was better with people than I was. She knew how to put them at ease. She used to say that a question asked with real interest was the most powerful tool in any room." A pause. "She said that's why I was good at interrogations, not because I was frightening, but because I actually wanted to know." Nora said nothing. The fire spoke for both of them. "She was fearless in a quiet way," he said, "not reckless. She understood risk. She just didn't let it stop her when she thought something mattered." He looked at the flames. "I used to think after she died that if I had been more attentive, I could have protected her. That it was my failure." "Was it?" "No, I know that now. She didn't tell me what she was doing because she knew I would try to manage the situation. She wanted to do it herself on her own terms." He was quiet. Knowing that and feeling it are different things. It took time to get to where knowing was enough. The snow pressed white against the window. The fire cracked. "She sounds worth grieving properly," Nora said. "She was." He looked at her. "She would have liked you." Nora considered this. "I would have been intimidated by her." "She would have enjoyed that," Caleb said. "She liked a challenge." There was a short silence, and then Nora smiled, the full one unguarded that changed her face entirely, and Caleb looked at that smile and looked away, and thought with the clarity of a man who had spent 20 years reading situations honestly that he was in considerable trouble. He didn't act on the thought. He just let it be there alongside everything else and picked up the trap again, and the fire burned on. The storm came on the 14th day. Not the weather storm that had been threatening for days and finally arrived overnight, dropping a foot of heavy snow on the ridge by morning and muffling the world to a gray-white silence. That storm was manageable. The other kind announced itself just after noon when Caleb stood at the window and watched 8 riders coming through the trees below. He counted them twice. Nora. She was already at the table with the rifle, having apparently reached the window before him. 8, she said. 2 carrying rifles unslung. The others have sidearms. Crane's at the front, Caleb said, in the gray coat. She looked. Yes, a pause. Fletcher. 3rd, from the left. She studied the riders for a moment. He looked smaller than I expected. They usually do. He moved to the door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit his face like a flat hand. He held the rifle across his body, visible but not aimed, and waited. The riders drew up at the edge of the clearing. Crane, in his pressed gray coat that looked wrong against all that snow, nudged his horse a step forward and regarded the cabin with the expression of a man calculating how much this was going to cost him. "Morrow," he said pleasantly, "I've come for my property." "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Caleb said. "The law disagrees." Crane reached inside his coat, not for a gun, but for papers, which was somehow worse. "I have a recovery order signed by Judge Perrin. Signed this morning." He held it up. "The woman, the minor, and the debt notes, all to be returned to Cedar Falls." "Lily Vale isn't here," Caleb said. "She will be, once her sister is persuaded." Crane's pleasant expression didn't change. "I'm a reasonable man, Morrow. Bring the woman out. Let me see the minor is not on these premises, and I'll leave you to your mountain. No need for unpleasantness." "Miss Vale," Caleb said, "is a free woman. She was free when I brought her up here, and she's free now." Crane tilted his head slightly. "That's a touching sentiment. Legally, however," "Legally," a voice said from behind Caleb, "you falsified 3 debt instruments and conspired in the death of at least one person who could prove it." Nora had come to stand in the doorway. She held the rifle at her side with the easy authority of someone who intended to use it if the situation required. She looked, Caleb thought, like exactly who she was, a woman who had been through the worst of what this particular man could do to her and had come out the other side of it with every one of her faculties intact and sharpened. Crane's pleasant expression fractured just briefly, just at the edges. "I have no idea what you think you—" "Agnes Pruitt," Nora said, "your housekeeper of 20 years. She has the original documents. The real ones with the real figures." She paused. "Marshal Holt has them now. He was in Laramie this morning at the federal marshal's office. So is Agnes." Another pause. "So is Lily." The silence that followed had a different quality from all the silences before it. Crane's eyes moved a rapid, involuntary inventory of the situation. The men behind him, the woman in the doorway, the man on the porch, the snow and the cold and the miles between here and anywhere his money and his judge still meant something. "That's a bluff," he said. "It isn't," Caleb said. "You can ride to Cedar Falls and find out. By the time you get there, the federal warrant will be issued and you'll be walking into it." From behind Crane, a voice, "Douglas?" "Fletcher Webb." He had ridden forward slightly, separating himself from the group. His voice was quiet. "Douglas, I think—" "Shut up, Fletcher. I think you should listen to—" "I said shut up!" Crane's composure had cracked fully now. The pleasant banker's face was gone. What was underneath it was smaller and meaner and more frightened, which made it more dangerous. He turned to the men behind him. "Take the woman. Take her, and we'll sort the rest later." No one moved. Caleb watched them. The 2 men who had been carrying rifles unslung were looking at each other. The others were looking at Fletcher Webb. Fletcher hadn't moved. He sat on his horse in the snow, with his face turned slightly to the side, looking at something that wasn't there at the middle distance, at 5 years of choices, at whatever it is a man looks at when he's finally deciding which side of himself he's going to be on. "Fletcher," Caleb said quietly. Not a challenge, not a threat. Fletcher looked at him. "I read Hank's letter," Caleb said. "I know you didn't give the order. I know you were hired to watch her, not to hurt her." He held Fletcher's eyes. "I think you've been living with that distinction for 5 years and finding it doesn't help as much as you thought it would." Fletcher's jaw moved once, then stopped. She would have forgiven you, Caleb said. Elena, she believed people could change. She told me that every time I got cynical, which was fairly often. He paused. I'm not saying it forgives anything. I'm saying this is the moment. Put it down or don't. The snow fell soft and steady into the silence. Fletcher Webb turned his horse sideways away from the cabin. It was a small movement. It put him out of the line of engagement. It meant he was done. Crane saw it. His face went to something cold and absolute, and he went for the gun at his hip. He was not fast. Caleb had known faster men and slower. Crane was a banker who had hired violence all his life and never had much occasion to practice it himself. His hand found the gun. He raised it. The shot that came was not from Caleb's rifle. It came from the tree line to the north. One clear shot, precise as a statement, that took Crane's gun out of his hand and left him staring at his empty palm with an expression of pure disbelief. Hank Doyle stepped out of the pines on a big roan horse rifle, still raised, four of his trapper crew emerging behind him from the trees on both sides of the clearing. Morning, Caleb, he said. You're early, Caleb said. Rode through the night. Holt sent word you might need company. Hank surveyed the scene with the unbothered competence of a man who had spent 30 years in rough country. This the banker. That's him. Hank looked at Crane, at the ruined hand, the torn coat, the pale face. Thought he'd be taller, he said. Crane's hired men, outnumbered and flanked, and watching their employer cradle his hand in the snow, made the sensible decision. One by one, rifles went down, hands went up, horses shifted sideways in the way of animals who have sensed the conclusion of something. Fletcher Webb sat his horse at the edge of the clearing and didn't speak. They brought Crane inside, which was not hospitality, but practicality. The cold was serious, and a dead prisoner was a complication nobody needed. He sat at Caleb's table in his torn gray coat and held his hand and said nothing. His men were disarmed and secured in the barn under Hank's supervision. Fletcher Webb sat outside on the porch steps and was left there, which was his own kind of decision. Nora stood by the fire. She looked at Crane for a long time, at this man who had taken her father's trust and bent it into a weapon, who had put her sister in a room and called it protection, who had held a leash made of paper and called it law. He was smaller than he had been, diminished. The careful competence was gone, and what was left was an ordinary frightened man in a dirty coat. She had imagined this moment many times in the past 3 years. In some versions, she said things she'd never forgiven herself for imagining. In others, she was dignified and precise. In the one she'd held on to on the worst days, she simply turned her back and walked away, which was its own kind of power. She did none of these things. She sat down across from him at the table. My father's name was Thomas Vale, she said. He was a school teacher in Rawlins for 11 years. He taught mathematics and Latin, and he believed in your fundamental decency because you had given him no reason not to. She paused. He died thinking the debt was real. He spent the last year of his life ashamed of himself for a failure that was yours, not his. Crane looked at the table. Agnes will testify, she said. Holt has the document. Fletcher Webb is outside, and I think he'll talk when he's ready. By the time the federal case is built, you will have nothing left, no bank, no judge, no contracts, no leverage. She paused. Nothing except whatever you can live with when there's nothing else to hide behind. Crane looked up. He was going to say something. She could see the calculations starting again, the instinct to manage the conversation, and then he saw her face, and whatever he was going to say didn't come. She stood. I want a written statement. Now, before anyone talks to anyone else, your account of the transactions, the alterations, the arrangement with Fletcher, and what you ordered done to Elena Morrow. All of it. She set paper and pen on the table in front of him. You'll do it because if you don't, the federal case will be built without your cooperation, and cooperation is the only thing you have left to offer. She stepped back. Crane looked at the pen and paper for a long moment. Then, with the slow movement of a man who has run out of angles, he picked up the pen. Fletcher was still on the porch steps when Caleb came out. The snow had stopped. The sky above the ridge was clearing from the west, and the late afternoon light was coming through the break at a low angle, turning the snow the color of old gold. Hank's men were moving in the yard, subdued and purposeful. Inside, Crane was writing. The world had rearranged itself while Caleb wasn't watching it the way worlds do. He sat down on the porch steps beside Fletcher. They sat for a while without speaking. Fletcher was 52, which surprised Caleb every time he thought about it. He looked older, his hair had gone fully white, and his face was weathered in the specific way of a man who had spent years outdoors and not sleeping well. He held his hat in his hands and turned it once, twice, the way a man fidgets when he's deciding whether to start talking. She asked me to come to her wedding, Fletcher said. Elena, when you two got married, I came because I was your partner, and that meant something. A pause. I remember her face, happiest I'd ever seen a person. Caleb said nothing. I took Crane's money 2 years before she died, told myself it was just surveillance work, just keeping an eye on people who were nosing around accounts that were above their station. Told myself nothing would come of it. He turned his hat again. And then it did. I know, Caleb said. I didn't give the order. I swear on whatever you want that I didn't give the order. His voice was not pleading. It was the voice of a man stating a fact he has lived with long enough to know its exact shape. But I knew what kind of man Crane was. I knew what he was capable of. And I kept his confidence anyway. He looked at the snow. There's no version of that where I come out clean. No, Caleb said. I've been waiting for you to catch up to it, Fletcher said. For 5 years. I kept thinking he'll figure it out. He'll come for me. And when you didn't, he stopped. I didn't know whether to be relieved or ashamed. Both, Caleb said. Probably. Fletcher looked at him finally. I'm sorry, Caleb. I know that's nothing. I know it doesn't. It's something, Caleb said. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. He looked out at the clearing at the gold light on the snow. Elena would have said the same thing I'm about to say, and I'm going to say it because I think she'd want me to, and because I've spent 5 years learning to listen to her even now. He paused. Tell Holt everything. Don't manage it, don't shape it, don't try to minimize your part, all of it, and then let what happens happen. That'll mean prison, Fletcher said. Maybe. Probably. Caleb looked at him. But you'll be out from under it. That's worth something. Fletcher was quiet for a long time. The gold light moved across the snow. The trees stood in their winter positions, bare and enduring and indifferent to human complications in the way that trees are. She was a good woman, Fletcher said. Elena. The best I ever knew, Caleb said. They sat together on the steps until the light was gone. Lily came up the mountain 3 days later. Marshal Holt brought her himself on a borrowed horse, and when Nora saw them coming through the pines, she went down the trail at a run, without her coat, without her hat, without any of the careful composure she had held for 14 days. She went down the trail, and Lily came off the horse before it stopped, and they met somewhere in the middle, and Caleb watched from the porch and didn't try to see their faces. He went inside and put more wood on the fire and set a pot on the stove. He could hear them outside coming up the path. Not words, just voices, the overlapping rhythm of two people saying everything at once. He busied himself with the stove and did not eavesdrop because some reunions were private even when you could hear them. When they came in both red-faced and wet-eyed and talking over each other in the way of people who have had weeks of words backed up and are releasing them all at once. Lily stopped short inside the door and looked at him. She was 16 but didn't look it. She had the eyes of someone who had been paying close attention to difficult things for a long time, which aged the eyes even when the face was still young. She had Nora's jaw and her father's coloring in the particular combination of wariness and curiosity that came from years of watching carefully while being underestimated. She looked at Caleb for a moment with the honest assessment of someone deciding what they thought, and she took her time about it. You're the one who bought my sister, she said. I paid money to get her off a platform, Caleb said, which is a different thing. Lily considered this. She told me about you, she said. Good things, I hope. Mostly, she said, with the brief particular smile of a younger sibling who knows exactly how to deploy that word. Nora covered her face with both hands and made a sound that was probably a laugh. Caleb poured 3 cups of coffee and set them on the table. Lily sat down and took one and wrapped both hands around it and looked at the fire with the expression of someone for whom warmth is still slightly novel, still something that requires a moment of acknowledgement. She was thin, not dramatically, but the thinness of someone who had not been eating quite enough for a while, who had been sleeping poorly and worrying constantly and maintaining somehow, in spite of all of that, a quality of interior steadiness that her sister had and that Caleb suspected was simply how Vale women were built. She told them everything. The days after Nora left the particular quality of that silence in the house, Crane's cold fury disguised as professional disappointment. The weeks of watching Agnes moving through the rooms with her habitual invisibility and her hidden agenda, the slight changes in how she positioned herself, the way she had begun slowly and without explanation to be somewhere nearby whenever Lily needed something. The night Agnes had come to Lily's door and said very quietly, "I think it's time, and I think I can help," and Lily had nodded and said, "I know I've been waiting," because she had been paying attention and she had seen the signs. Agnes herself was in Cheyenne now, with Hank's sister, and was apparently doing fine and had already taken charge of the sister's kitchen, which Holt relayed with the tone of a man both amused and slightly relieved that someone else was managing it. "She kept that document for 2 years," Lily said, "in a box under her bed. She used to take it out and look at it," she told me, to remind herself that she wasn't imagining things. She paused. She was very frightened, but she did it anyway. "She did," Nora said. "That's the bravest kind of brave," Lily said. "When you're afraid and you do it anyway." She looked at Caleb. "Like you, on the platform. You weren't supposed to be there. You didn't know her. You were afraid too, I think." Caleb looked at the fire. "Somewhat," he said. "I thought so," Lily said with the satisfaction of someone whose analysis has been confirmed. "Nora said you weren't, but I thought differently. I was right." "You were right," Caleb said. Lily nodded, finished her coffee, and announced that she was going to find the woodpecker Nora had mentioned in one of her letters and went outside with the focused air of someone who has decided on a project. Nora looked at her empty coffee cup, then at Caleb. "She's going to be all right," Nora said. It was not quite a question. "She's going to be remarkable," Caleb said. "She already is." Nora looked at the window where they could see Lily's figure, moving through the yard with her head tilted back, searching the trees. Something moved in her face, not grief exactly, but the feeling adjacent to grief that comes when you realize the thing you were most afraid of losing is still there. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shook his head. "She got herself out with Agnes's help. I provided the address." "Stop doing that," he looked at her. "Stop minimizing what you did," she said. "It's a habit you have, and it's an annoying one. You helped. You're allowed to have helped. Accept it." He looked at her for a moment, then noted. "Good," she said. The federal case moved quickly for a federal case. Holt had gone straight to the marshal in Laramie, who had been looking for grounds to examine the First Territorial Bank for 2 years and needed only the document Agnes produced in Crane's own written statement to proceed. The amended debt instruments were voided. The original figures were restored, and the accounts, what remained of them, were made available to the families who had been defrauded. Judge Perrin resigned quietly and was not replaced with a better man because territory courts moved at their own pace, but at least he was gone. Fletcher Webb was tried in the spring. He did what Caleb had asked, told everything, shaped nothing, minimized nothing. He received 3 years in the territorial prison, which was less than many thought appropriate and more than a few others thought necessary. He served his time without complaint, which was all anyone could ask. Crane received 12 years. On the day the sentence was announced, Nora was at the table reading a catalog from a medical school in Philadelphia. She read the announcement when Holt brought it up, set the paper down, sat with her hands flat on the table for a moment, and then turned back to the catalog. Caleb watched her. 12 years, she said. "Yes. Is that enough?" "For my wife," he considered. "No, for the other families possibly." He looked at the window. "For you, my mom." She thought about it honestly. "It's justice," she said, "which is different from enough. But it's more than I had." She turned a page in the catalog. "This school has a women's program. Started 3 years ago. How many in the first cohort?" 14. 7 graduated." She looked at the page. "I can pass the entrance exam. I know I can." "I know you can too," he said. She looked up. "Lily wants to stay here while I'm gone. She's already named every one of your traps, and she's teaching herself Latin from your dictionary." "I know. She told me she's going to name the woodpecker too." "You're all right with that?" He looked at her. "I am very all right with that," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she smiled. Not the careful, controlled expression she'd worn for most of their first days, but something fuller, less defended. It changed her face the way light changes a landscape, the same geography, but suddenly you could see all of it. "Caleb," she said. "Yes, when I come back, when I'm done with school, and I'm a physician, and I come back to this mountain." "Yes," he said. She stopped. "I didn't finish." "I know," he said. "The answer's still yes." She laughed. It was a sound like water over stones. Not sweet exactly, but real. The kind of laughter that comes from the chest rather than the throat. Outside, Lily was trying to explain the ablative absolute to the woodpecker. The woodpecker, for its part, was being uncooperative. The wedding was a year later, almost to the day in early autumn, when the aspens had gone gold again. It was a small affair. Hank and four of his trappers, Holt and his deputy Agnes, come up from Cheyenne for the occasion, looking well and formidable. Lily, and a handful of people from Cedar Falls, who had driven up the mountain out of a combination of curiosity and genuine goodwill. There was no church. There was no elaborate ceremony. There was Holt, who had acquired the legal standing to officiate, and the clearing in front of the cabin, and the peaks catching the late afternoon light, and everything ordinary and everything holy about two people standing together and choosing. Nora wore her own dress, dark green, wool-fitted, and plain, which was her preference and suited her. She carried a loose bundle of wild asters she had picked that morning, which Lily had tied with twine and presented with an air of great ceremony. Caleb wore a clean shirt and his least battered coat and had apparently argued with Lily about the hat for 15 minutes before she won. He looked like what he was, a man who had learned slowly and at some cost that the world was capable of being better than it had been. Holt said the words. They said theirs. When they kissed, Hank let out a sound that could charitably be described as a cheer, and Agnes covered her eyes with her handkerchief, and Lily, who had been maintaining the expression of great dignity appropriate to a ceremony, abruptly abandoned it and made a noise that was entirely undignified and entirely right. Later, when the others were gathered around the fire and the smell of coffee and wood smoke mixed with the cold autumn air, Caleb and Nora stood at the fence at the edge of the clearing and watched the sun go down behind the peaks. The light came in horizontal and warm the way autumn light does, turning everything it touched to something richer than its ordinary self. The pines went amber. The snow on the high ridges went pink. The world was briefly unreasonably beautiful in the way that worlds sometimes are. I thought the day on that platform was the worst of my life, Nora said. It might have been, Caleb said. It might have been, she agreed, but here we are. He looked at her. She was watching the mountains with the particular focus of a person trying to hold a moment still. He understood that. He had learned it from Elena, who had known that the good moments were worth the effort of paying attention to them. Here we are, he said. She leaned against him, her head at his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there while the sun finished its work and the sky turned the particular blue that comes just after sunset and just before dark, which is its own brief country. From inside the cabin, Lily's laughter. From somewhere above, a hawk, one long cry, then silence. The mountain held them. The wind was still for once, as though even the weather had decided to let this particular moment be. 3 years later, Nora Vale Morrow returned to Cedar Falls in October. She had her medical degree. She had taken the train from Philadelphia to Denver, hired a horse in Laramie, and ridden the last 30 miles herself because she wanted to, because the country demanded to be moved through rather than conveyed past. At Cedar Falls, she stopped at the Mercantile, where the old platform in front of the burned-out building had long since been cleared away and replaced with a flower bed, which someone had planted and someone else maintained, the town's small and wordless act of accounting. She bought salt and flour and coffee and a length of rope because Caleb had asked her to pick them up on the way through and because the symmetry of it pleased her. She rode up the mountain in the afternoon. The aspens were gold, the same gold as the day she had first ridden this trail, seen from the other side, now coming towards something rather than away. She remembered the stiffness in her spine that first ride, the effort of holding herself apart, the particular vigilance of a person who has learned that relaxing is expensive. She didn't feel any of that now. She came around the last bend, and the cabin was there, larger than she had left it, a new room added off the south side for the medical supplies she'd been shipping ahead for 2 months, a second corral built near the barn. Smoke from the chimney, the bay gelding in the corral, and on the porch Caleb with a cup of coffee, watching her come up the trail. He looked the same. Older maybe in the way 5 years adds something to a face, a deepening rather than a diminishing. He had let the beard come back, which she had expected. He had apparently lost an argument with Lily about the porch railing, which was now painted a color Nora could only describe as a pinyon. She rode into the yard and dismounted. He came down the steps. They stood in the yard with 3 years between them. 3 years of letters in the particular loneliness of chosen absence, in the knowledge constant and sustaining that the absence was finite. He took her face in both hands. She put her hands over his. Physician, he said. Eventually, what she said, starting with the county and working outward. Lily's been organizing your supply room. Of course she has. She looked at him. Is she well? She's been accepted to the university in Laramie, starts in spring. His eyes were warm. Mathematics and Latin, apparently. Nora laughed. She pressed her face briefly against his chest, just a moment, just the warmth of it, and then looked up. Is the mountain still ours? She asked. Always was, he said. Behind them, the cabin door opened, and Lily came out on the porch with her own coffee and her expression of great dignity, and said, "You're both being very emotional, and I want you to know I support it fully," and then went back inside and the door banged shut, and they could hear her laughing through the wall. Caleb looked at Nora. Nora looked at Caleb. "We should go in," he said. "We should," she agreed. They did. The mountain stood as mountains do, patient and indifferent to the small ceremonies performed at its feet, the weddings and the homecomings, and the grief and the gradual difficult work of becoming whole. The aspens turned and dropped their leaves and came back in the spring. The creek ran. The hawk called from its height and was not answered. And in the cabin on the ridge, which was larger now and brighter, and smelled of coffee and medicine and the particular kind of ordinary life that people build, when they have survived the worst of what they feared and found on the other side of it, each other in that cabin for many years to come. There was light in the windows at night, and laughter when the wind dropped, and the quiet work of two lives lived alongside each other, like two rivers finding the same valley. Which is in the end what love is. Not rescue, not papers or platforms or prices paid, but two people who kept choosing each other day after ordinary day for all the years the mountain gave them. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to follow more stories of courage, love, and second chances. New stories every week, and we'd love to hear which part stayed with you.